excited to have Paul Gibson with us today. And Ryan is the wizard of customer interviews, customer research interviews, and all things related to getting to know your customer. And also the founder of Content Lift, which is dubbed a customer investigations company. So you consult, you help train people on how to get to know the customer. And I'm excited because today we're going to talk about why customer interviews are so important, how you would go about building a program internally, and what you do with the information that you get out of customer research interviews so that they actually do something for you, right? So this is going to be for any marketers out there who are thinking about doing this. This is quite a bit of investment. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort, maybe effort and time that you're not currently putting in. So what can you expect to get out of it? We want to hit that today. So welcome, Ryan. Glad you could make it today.
First time I've been called a wizard. Yeah, I was gonna say my son will like that. He's big into Dungeons and Dragons right now, so I'll let him know.
There you go. That's better than all like I'm a marketing Jedi. There, like, I feel like 10 years ago, that was like the thing. Just like, I'm going to call myself something
guru,
ridiculous.
ninja, you name it, it's all there.
Yeah. Maybe we should just spend the whole time talking about marketing lingo. As one marketer to another, and me being more of a marketing generalist, handling a lot of different types of marketing channels and strategies and tactics in my world, and you being a very specific specialist in this very specific thing, very essential thing, I would love to know where you got started and why you felt like this was something you wanted to double down on.
Oh yeah, that'll take up the whole episode. So I'll give you like the Coles notes. I've been in the business world for over 20 years, mostly like business to business. But that was like one of the first things I always leaned on. I actually started in the franchising industry. I'm in Canada and I worked for a chain of coffee shops. I was the director of operations and marketing. In that world, because it was a consumer-based environment where for franchise systems, like you have to build the marketplace for your franchisees, right? Like their whole thing is they come in, they buy a concept. There's already an established market. They're just paying cash to get customers. My job is to create that market. So I had to do all the research myself because B2C research is actually they do a ton. They don't think they realize how much research goes into consumer products, but it's expensive. So we can afford it. I had to do it. So I would do all the things you hear about, like observational work, which is like seeing how people buy and watching them move through lines. I would do person on the street interviews. I'd be talking to them, doing surveys in person, maybe on the phone. And then I would actually go into the stores of competitors and pretend I was a customer, start talking to people about like why they buy it. And people thought I was crazy, but I had to understand why people were making the decisions they made. Because if I understood that, I knew where to throw my efforts strategically in the business. So that's where it started. And then what's unique to me is I took a pause in my business career and I went and took broadcasting at community college. And I ended up actually becoming a TV and radio reporter for 3 years. And I worked for a year on the investigations unit here in Ottawa. And that just sort of like really cemented what I bring to the table now, which is very unique to me. And then I was like, this is fun, but it's not my calling. So I went back to the business world and I've just leaned into that since then. So to your question, Danny, like how did it become the thing? I started working for myself 4 years ago. I was just as a general contractor for hire. And I had a client ask me to do some qualitative customer research interviews around a product. And I did it. And I was like, I forgot how much fun it was because I'd just been doing a lot of content during that time as a contractor. And I was like, man, I forgot how much I really liked that. I wonder if that could be the thing. There's no way that could be the thing. That's crazy to think that could be the thing. I just looked around and people were doing it. And I was like, okay, so how do I going to position myself in the market? I just leaned into it for the last 2.5 years. And that's all I do now is customer research interviews. So that's the story there.
I love it. I love how it started with like investigative journalism. I love how it started in a B2C environment where you can sit there and like watch people and see how they're going about something. It's like a smaller transaction, right? Buying a cup of coffee, but like seeing it all live with your own eyes. I feel like in the B2B world, you kind of feel like, man, it's all dark, right? There's the term dark social, dark funnel, all this kind of stuff. And you feel like I'm trying to piece together all this data, all this information from all these sources, all these different tools, and there's lots of solutions out there to try and help clean this up, but it's hard to see that. And that's, I think, what you're bringing to companies that you work with is this ability to fill in a lot of those gaps.
Yeah.
It's cool to hear all that backstory of how you got to where you are, and it makes complete sense. The kind of the crux of this, in my opinion, is why should marketers invest all this time into conversations with their customers when they are already inundated with a lot of data and there's lots of audience tools. There's a lot that they have access to. I think if you were to ask people, a lot of them would just be like, I know I need to do this. If I had people lining up to talk to me, I'd probably talk to my customers more, but I don't know how to even go about it. So, I mean, start with the first question. Why does this matter in a world when you have a lot of audience
Yeah.
data that you can pull
So
from
there's,
already?
like most things, there's a few reasons that sort of come together of why. The short answer is, um, if without it, your odds of winning in a market are almost zero, right? That's sort of like the high level thing I tell people. But to unpack that a little bit, you have to think about the nature of how people buy solutions and like why they buy them in the first place. So, I grew up in B2B really in the last 12 years, especially with the prevalence of where digital took over the old way, which the old way was you would walk. I was that buyer in the old way. You'd walk a trade show floor, you'd have a relationship with a salesperson, you subscribe to magazines that get delivered to your desk, right? And then when digital first came on, it was like digital marketing. Now it's the default. It is the way our economy works. So it is how people process and exchange information. So to go back, like you have to understand why people buy. What is the thing they want to get done? And why does that thing exist in the first place? Or one way I articulated, Danny, is like solutions don't solve problems on their own. They are embedded to help a business process that exists, right? So, what is that process and why? The challenge with all the data you're talking about is it just shows you like actions. It shows you like a thing took place. It shows like something, what happened. I clicked here, I posted here, I filled out this form. Great. But what was the intention behind those actions? Why were those the things that you did? And what brought you here in the first place? And the last thing I'll say to frame it is when people get to that like nature of being on a website, having higher intent, maybe talking to a salesperson, installing a product. They've done a lot of self-education by that point, and they've spun up their own narrative about why this solution might work for them. And now they're just looking to sort of validate their pre-existing beliefs. Most of the big analysts and firms like McKinsey, Gartner, Harvard Business Review, they'll talk about this in some shape or form, right? By the time they get to you, they've almost made up their mind. You talk about dark social, right? If you don't understand this process of how they're making decisions and thinking about what they want to solve and how they're prioritizing different solutions within their business before they get to you, you're not going to influence that process. And that's what marketing does. So the dashboards don't tell you that part. The only way you can really get to that part is extracting those things from customers. I hope that answered the question because I went on a bit there, but like that's sort of how I think of those
Totally.
things, of like why you should do it.
Yeah. A lot of people talk about this in terms of demand capture and demand creation, right? And it seems like where you're talking about demand capture, that seems to be where a lot of people live. It's like you have some intent signals. It's maybe they're searching on Google. You have something to go off of, and that's those actions that they're taking once you know that they know about you. But like what you're saying, most people, they know about you before you know that, or they've done a lot of things that you couldn't have tracked beforehand. And now, like with your definition there, obviously, I need to know why a customer would even need me. I need to know why. Not just the whats,
Yeah,
but the
exactly.
whys, right? So if you've made your entire livelihood on this specialty, why don't more marketers do this? Like, why is it even possible for you to have a full-time job helping people figure out that, hey, you need to dive into this? I mean, I think it's indicative that there's a huge need out there, right? But why is that need there? Why
Yeah,
don't marketers spend more time face to face with their customers?
that's a great question. When I was trying to figure out whether this was a thing, because I saw other people do it, but you always have to validate whether there's enough, to use your word, intent, right? And there's enough signal in a market to understand that it's worth pursuing. So I had to go do it. I would talk to 24
Yeah.
VPs of marketing, CMOs, senior marketers, like how this qualitative customer research fits into their business. And these are things that I heard, right? So we don't have experience in it, so we don't really know how to do it. We don't know how to use the insights. We don't have bandwidth. We don't have time. We don't want to bother our customers. We're not allowed. No one will let us. We did it before, but we didn't see the value. We're intimidated. Like those are all the things that I hear, right? And a lot of it comes down to you just don't know what you don't. You don't know what you don't. And you get really
Yeah.
founders and business leaders as they're growing a company. Now you get myopic on those high intent business opportunities. And that tends to color your thinking about like what you should be focusing on. And that's not wrong because those people, you have to create a business around them. But we talked a bit about like that demand capture versus demand creation. If you're talking to a customer, sometimes what I like to do is figure out the timeline. Like when did the idea of trying to solve a problem start to when they actually bought? And I've heard as long as 3 years. I've talked to someone and said, oh, I knew your solution existed for 3 years, but I didn't buy for XYZ in those 3 years because of all these reasons. those are important things to know, because if you have the ability to just keep in front of that person and stay top of mind, which is your job as a marketer, to get into a market, present yourself and stay top of mind. If you know that process, then you know how to move them along and keep their affinity towards you, because it's so easy for someone else to come in during that time and be the shiny new object they think is going to solve their problem, right? Especially in commodified competitive markets, right? Service-based businesses too.
I love that. And in a world right now where, I mean, it's not unique to where we are right now. It's been this way for a long time, but marketers need to justify all their actions. Their job is to grow the company. And I feel like a lot of activity that marketers are pushed into doing is the stuff that is a lot more easily attributed using all the tools and stuff that we talked about, right? All the data, all the stuff that you can put on a dashboard, right? Because that's how leadership looked at things. But if all of a sudden you have a bunch of customer interview recordings that say, actually, this process begins 3 years before we even get to the point where we're closing a deal, or then that data is enough, hopefully, to help marketers start to do things that they know they should be doing, they want to do, but they often have a hard time getting buy-in. Like some of those high awareness, high funnel type activities, some things that like you kind of go into marketing wanting to be able to do, but then you get there and it's hard to like justify those actions. So I'm excited because you're going to share with us, we're going to dive into some specifics here, but like some tactical, how do we actually launch these programs? But I'm excited because I also hope that marketers decide to gather this kind of qualitative data, these insights, that they'll be able to use that to do what they actually know they should do what they want to do, and meet the customer a lot earlier in the funnel.
Like, just if I may, just quickly on that, I've been that marketer like wants to try things, has instincts about something we might try. But the first thing I'll ask is, how do you know you're right? What's guiding your decision around the thing you want to try? And then I've been at a leadership table, smaller companies. I think what people sometimes don't understand is the anxiety they face around making the wrong decision. And there's only so much money to go around. And they're trying to understand, okay, should this team get more money or this team get more money? So you can't just present an idea and say, I want to do this, because they're going to come to you, okay, well, why are we doing this? Like, what do we think is going to happen? Show me like the strategy and the plan behind this thought process. If you can't bring that out and use data to inform that, the odds of you getting the things you want to get done are dramatically low. So it's great to have all these ideas, but you also have to create the environment where you're entrusted to that this is the right course of action.
So then let's say we're invested, we're in, how do we even go about it? So we've got to figure out, where do I start? I've got to figure out who I'm going to interview. I've got to figure out, how do I interview them? What do I even ask? I mean, so let's just start with the beginning. Let's say you're a brand new marketer in a company. Where do you start as you launch this program?
So the first thing I always think about is like, what is it you want to know? Where's the gaps in your knowledge? There's different types of conversations you can have with customers. I do buyer journey investigations. That's sort of my focus, because I want to inform a go-to-market strategy. But there's product development or new markets, like customer discovery is what they often call it. There's UI UX if you have some type of product, but the UI UX can be the experience if you're a productized service or service-based business. Like, what is the experience the customer has with you? You can do win-loss audits or sales audits. You can do even case studies or a type of research investigation, right? There's different ways that you can get at things. Brand and identity is a big one. That's different. Like, that's the perception people have of your company. That can be a whole conversation. And what are different brands that they compare you against? So you have to figure, like, what is it I want to know and why? Because what is the thing I'm trying to achieve? And then that you work backwards from there to set your objectives and your guiding topics of conversation. That's the starting point for me. And then you also want to figure out what is the type of role and business model that you want to talk to. Because different roles and different business models will have different pains and concerns and challenges and priorities, right? So one of the examples I'll often give is, say I'm a IT director at a software company, and it has like 1,000 people headcount, with like half the employees are software developers. If I talk to an IT director at a hospital, where there might be 3 software engineers working for that entire hospital, those worlds are so dramatically different, but often we go after that role or that part of the persona, right? And we compare them apples to apples, but they're different. So and the reason that matters is that the insights you get from those people about what they care about and why then start to influence your marketing. But if they're from different sample sets, it's going to really throw your insights off. And then you could start spending money in the wrong direction as a marketer, right? Because actually an IT director at a SaaS company is actually not your best fit client. The hospital is your best fit client. And this is why. So that's the next step.
You're kind of touching on some anxiety I feel as I try and approach customer interviews, which is like, I know that it's like garbage in,
Yeah.
garbage out kind of thing, right? And if I'm not really, really careful about what I choose to take away and thus like just a couple steps back, what I choose to pursue, then I'm gonna lead myself astray because there's there's always this feeling of, well, do I really want everyone's opinion? Obviously not. Like you said, if it's the hospital that you need to go after, like you only want theirs and you have to be super careful about who you choose to
Yeah.
talk to. And that could easily like derail entirely everything if you're not
Yeah.
listening to the right people. On more of a data side, if you're looking at the wrong metrics, you're looking at the wrong KPIs and holding yourself accountable to those, you're going to be messed up at the end. You're not actually going to sort of drive revenue. So you've narrowed down sort of the persona and you've narrowed down the ICP, sort of the industry and maybe the business model that you're after. How do you go about actually like from, okay, I've got like an ideal person in my mind. How do I then set up, I don't know how many interviews, 10 to 20, 30, 50
Yeah.
interviews from there?
So this is an interesting one for me, maybe because I'm a researcher nerd now, but I get this question a lot. Like, how many people do I need to talk to? Well, your question is like, how do I set up and how many people? The setup is actually not complicated. It's really just
Yep.
either going through a list of customers you have, going through your networks, going into communities, right? There's now Slack and Discord communities and whatever, Reddit, right? There's ways to find people that sort of fit firmographically and psychographically the type of person business you're looking for. And often it's just an email or a DM. The key part is, Danny, though, you want to make it very clear. You're not trying to sell them anything at that point because that's where it often falls down. People are hypersensitive to solicitation now, and I get why. So how I frame it is, listen, I want to talk to you about your experience. You are an expert in this based on what I can see. I'd love just 30 minutes of your time, but that's it. Like that's sort of how I do it. There's no magic to it. You just have better odds if one, they know what you're trying to talk about. You sort of lean into their expertise and why them. And if you already have a connection, even better. So if you have a sales team or a customer success team, someone in your network, the more they know you or there's a connection to you, even through a friend, the odds are higher that you'll get someone. So that's the first part. How many people? Researchers debate this. And it doesn't matter if it's like product researchers, customer success researchers, whatever. Here's what the research around research says, which is like super meta statement. But I've read the peer-reviewed papers around sample sizes for this type of work. So the key thing you need to understand is a term called insight saturation when it comes to this type of research. And that's just a fancy way of saying, when do I stop learning new things? I start hearing the same things over and over again. Most of the research shows that you start to hear the same things over and over again. If you've done all that work I talked about well, at segmenting, finding the right best fit people, you start to hit that insight saturation around 7 conversations. That's it, 7. Doesn't like that's not a lot.
That's it.
Now
Yeah, that's
that only is going to
surprising.
cover, well, if you plotted all the bell curve, like if you know what these are all the things I want to understand and these are all the new learnings, you're covering off about 80 to 85% of the learnings, about 7. By the time you get to 12 or 15, you've probably covered off 100%. But the key is having it really, really fine-tuned objective and sense of who you're talking to. So that makes it, I think, a little less of a daunting task for people.
Yeah. I feel like I
Yeah,
could do
and
that, right?
you can talk to as many as you want, though. That's the thing. It's just that you have diminishing returns in your time because if you get to 25, 30, 40, you might hear something new. The odds are low that you will. I like that approach because it leads towards more agility in research. Because at the end of the day, it's not an academic process. You don't have 2 years to put something together. You might have 2 or 3 months. So speaking to 7 to 12 customers with specific objectives around something you want to know, you can get some really clear insights to sort of then aggregate and then start making actions out of that in the business. So yeah, that's how I'd reach out and that's how many people I would talk to.
Yeah, no, for me and my team as a marketing agency, we target really smart CMOs, heads of digital, heads of SEO, of paid advertising, of content. And we set a goal at the beginning of this year. Let's interview one person per week for the
Yeah.
entire year, right? And at the time, it felt pretty aggressive. Like, how in the world are we going to do this? Because again, we hadn't done this before. We hadn't like built a program around it. But what I found is that, like you said, when you reach out to these people and you have a very specific question in mind and you make it very clear that you're just looking to pick their brains, the response rates are
Yeah.
actually extremely high. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk real quick about some
Okay.
questions, right? I assume that you want to have as much as possible consistency in your questions from interview to interview so that you can kind of start to track some patterns, but maybe that's not right. Tell me a little bit about your
Yeah.
preparation as you lead into an interview.
Let me tell you a story first, like the first time I did an interview, and that sort of will help you get a sense of how I don't think you should approach it.
Perfect.
So one of the first interviews I ever did This is when I was a reporter. I had a big laundry list of questions, right? I probably had like 20. I had my mic, and I had my attention was always focused on these specific questions, very precise questions. So I hold my mic out and I'd ask question one, and they start talking. And then what happens is I start getting paranoid about the next question. And I'm like looking at the next question. Okay, think about this question. Okay, yeah. And then, okay, they stop talking. Okay, perfect. I'm question two, right? Don't do that. Because here's what happened. I went back to the studio, listened to the tape, and there was all these areas where they said something so fascinating because I was so hyper-focused on maintaining the order of how I thought it should go. I missed all these chances to ask follow-up questions. And I didn't really get the things I wanted to get. So I actually don't like a list of questions, funny enough. There are some interviewers I know who do this work, they have 0 question. They'll just start with 1 question, and they just sort of, it's like jazz from there. They sort of feel their way around. So they'll ask, what was happening the day you started thinking of solving this problem? Let's start there. And they sort of just take you through a narrative and a story. That's okay. But you said something, I think, important. You want consistency in the interviews. And the challenge with that sort of meandering narrative is people don't talk in a linear fashion. They will combine answers, right? They sometimes give you things you don't want, or they're answering the question in a way that they thought you meant something else. Like there's all these things people do in that environment that aren't always helpful. So your job is sort of keep them on track. So what do I write? I like to have sort of 4 or 5 overarching topics and themes that I want to touch on, right? So, the buying journey, maybe how they evaluated, pains and challenges in their role, whatever. And I'll have some starting questions. But then what happens is I know for the first 5 minutes, I want to talk about this subject. And then I'll start off with a question, and now I'm listening to what they're saying. I'm like, interesting. Okay, that aligns to what I want to know. That aligns. Oh, that was what you just said there. I want to touch on that, expand on that. And that sort of gives you structure, but freedom to move in new directions. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with having a list of questions, because what you're going to find when you do it when you're new to this work, the questions actually do help guide your thought process. Yeah. But after a while, they can become a crutch. So it's finding that balance between what do I need to know for my research objectives, and how do I allow breathing room for some natural discovery?
You answered that expertly, because before this, I sent you a giant list of questions, right, for this interview. So you made me feel like, all right, it's okay, right? But no, I like what you're saying. You know that there's like 4 or 5 things I need to get out of this interview. And so I'm going to make sure I hit those checkpoints along the way. But you can't be so focused on your questions that you don't like actually listen, right? That defeats the entire purpose.
Yeah. Active listening is the critical part of it.
Yeah.
Because the active listening helps you understand, are you getting what you need out of this conversation? And sometimes you don't. But the only way you're going to figure out if you are meeting the list of criteria you're hoping to meet is by actually listening to the dialogue that's being said. And then what I will do is I start crossing things off, and like we touched on that, because sometimes people will answer something that you want to learn without you ever asking the question. They just naturally lean into it. I'm like, okay, that's off the list. Don't have to ask that question anymore. And then I'll look at the time, like, okay, I got 10 minutes. Okay, this is irrelevant. This is irrelevant. This is just nice to know. Okay, this is the thing I want to know.
Yep.
Right? That takes practice. That takes time. I'm zeroing in on 1,900 interviews.
Wow.
In my career.
Yeah.
So, there's just a natural instinct that I have now that's built up. But these are some things you can think of in this arena to like sort of really help guide what you're doing.
Yep. So how do you go about codifying and communicating the learnings that you get out of these interviews in the best way possible, especially for leadership?
So here's my pro tip. Besides not having the giant list of questions, record it, get it transcribed, or at least have the notes. Because if you don't, you are not going to remember everything. I've seen people walk away from interviews, product marketing managers, directors of marketing. They have like 4 sentences on a piece of paper after a half-hour conversation because they think they're going to retain all the information. You cannot. Your brain does not have the cognitive load. So for anyone listening to this, what did Danny and I talk about 15 minutes ago? Right? Like you can't recall that information, which is why the recording helps you and the transcription helps you sort of retain it. But the transcription also helps you start to codify. That's the word you use. Researchers use that word. And that's just saying, okay, I'm highlighting all the key pieces of information that I want to know, and I'm summarizing it. So here's my process. I go into my Google Meet transcription, or if I did a Rev transcription or whatever it was, I use a piece of software called Dovetail. It's free. There's other research softwares where they transcribe things. And I just start highlighting. Okay, One of my objectives was I want to understand what the trigger was for them starting to look for a website agency. Okay, so I highlight all the answers that fit within that topic, and then I consolidate them into one core answer, and that's what gets shared with leadership, right? Because if you look at my work, I actually have very long research documents, but there's an executive summary that I share with everybody.
Yep.
Because that's what they care about is the highlights,
Yep.
not the in-depth work, not the voice of the customer stuff where you might pull things out for ads and copy and messaging. Give me the brass tacks. What started the initial research, initial process for looking for an agency. So that's how I started to do it. It's called content analysis. I sort of just take those buckets that we talked about, those topics of discussion, which is why I'm a big fan of setting them out front, because then that naturally just lends to like how you're going to organize all that information, right? And just pull it out, the small parts, and pull it out and put it in the right spot, the right puzzle piece. And then you summarize all that, and that's what gets shared.
I'm envisioning this research presentation or document in which like first slide, first page is just boom, boom, boom. Here are the bullets. Here's the absolute most important takeaways. And then if you're in a marketing team, and I've kind of done this with my own team, actually saying, all right, here's the takeaways. And then here's what we intend to do about them, like coming to leadership with that preparation as well. But then you have also all of that to back it up. Nobody's going to like actually go read through every single thing. They're not going to read every transcript, but you got to like provide that, this is as good as a dashboard. Like we were talking about at the beginning. They've got to trust their data that's feeding a dashboard that leads to all these decisions. They've got to trust the data that's leading into this executive brief.
Absolutely. Like I work with a client now, everything lives in a shared wiki, and their entire buying journey process from why people are seeking them out in solution, what does that ideal buyer look like, what do they care about, what triggers a search, how they evaluate software to a short list, how they evaluate within that short list, like how do they win deals, why would they lose deals, what causes people to find in their solution. All that stuff's lined out in short form in that wiki, so anyone can access it at any time and get reminded. Because this is my last point is this is the actual easy part. The harder part is changing the mindsets of everyone. I worked with a company, it's on my website, Content Lift, it's a company called Rewind. I did a research project for them. We figured out like the buyer we were targeting was off. But even a year after we did the research, people were still referencing the older style buyer. And they were like, well, this buyer who does this, I'm like, no. Remember, we did this project a year ago. This is the actual buyer. Because this stuff takes time for people to just sort of shake out of their brain and think of it as in a new lens. So yeah, like those short snippets, centralized and continually socialized and educated in the company, that's the key part.
Not even something I've really been thinking about, right? Because you'd hope that once you've delivered all this, it's like, boom, we're off to the races.
That's what I thought. And that has not been my experience.
I feel like someone listening to this would be able to say, okay, I think I have what I need at least to launch a program like this. But it's a little discouraging to be like, is any of this going to move things forward? If you could talk to top leadership and be like, listen, this is what you got to do to actually get this through everyone's heads. What advice do you give on that?
For me, it circles back to the first question, like, why would you do it? So the advice I have is always use the research as the focal point of your discussion in every discussion you have. When I'm in meetings with clients, I shy away from I statements, I just use an I statement. How I try to phrase things is the data suggests this. Our ideal buyers have said this. I don't understand this based on the research we have. What's informing this decision, right? So then it's not me, it's the research. But the trick is I do it all the time. And and even further to your question, I try to be the person that knows more about the customer than anybody else.
Yeah.
Because that actually does resonate. You said it yourself. Executives will focus on and pick up on things that customers are saying because they know enough to understand over the course of their career. That's what drives their business is an understanding of the customer. Now, we can have debates about what to do, right? We might say, here's what the data suggests. And then you and I, Danny, can actually have a difference of opinion, but at least it's one of, we're starting from the same ground, right? It was an honest debate. It's not like my opinion or politics or whatever. We're actually having a discussion. Okay, well, what should we do this or do this based on the data? So that's my advice is just sort of continue to have that as the way you make decisions. And trust me, that goes a long way.
Yeah.
When you start showing people that you really understand buyers and customers at a really deep level. And it just guides all your decisions about how you're going to move forward.
Yeah. And I love that callback to like, here's where my assumptions are coming from. Boom. Here's all this data. Here's all this work. Here's, where yours coming from. And it's not like a combative question.
Yeah.
Maybe they've been
It's
doing
not.
their own research on their own end and they've got something else to show you and to help you learn, right?
Exactly. Because remember that the people you work with have different lenses of what they're doing in the company.
Yep.
And they are right, because everyone's always partly right.
Mhm.
But your job is to figure out, okay, you put the voice of the customer in the room, right? And then say, okay, that's a really interesting take. Understand that. Here's some thoughts around me. Here's what the customer's saying. How can we come together and find a solution?
Right.
Because you're right. It's not combative. It's always, my lens is like, what's best for the customer in the business.
Yep. I love it. Honestly, like, again, thank you so much for giving all this. Like, this is incredible. I am going to take this to my team as well. I'm going to take a lot of things from this and try and implement an awesome program. I really believe that when marketers kind of go into marketing, oftentimes, at least I've talked to a lot of students. I work with some students and like kind of sort of help them understand where they want to go as far as marketing. And oftentimes when I ask, like, why do you want to go into this? Their response is like, I love the psychology of it, right? A lot of them love like the creative and data side kind of coming together, but many of them will say, I love the psychology of marketing. I want to go in psychology. I love learning about people, what makes them tick, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then we kind of get into our marketing careers and we're just like surrounded by tons of data, tons of channels, tons of tools, tons of tasks. And that kind of like
Yeah.
curiosity can sometimes get drowned out. And I love that this is kind of bringing us back to oftentimes what we're most interested in as marketers, which is just understanding how people think, how they tick. So thank you so much for
this is a big one for me too, right? So
yeah. Thank you so much for hopping on with me. And you can find Ryan all over LinkedIn. And again,
yeah, too much. I'm there too much.
No, I love it. And then also at contentlift.io, where you can learn more about what Ryan does. So thanks again for hopping on, Ryan, and we'll talk to you soon.